welcome to On This Day in Tudor History with me, Claire Ridgway, author of On This Day in Tudor History and quite a few books on Tudor history and Anne Boleyn. Now, of course, on this day in Tudor history, the 19th of May, 1536, Queen Anne Boleyn was executed within the confines of the Tower of London, a subject that I've written quite a lot about. And I'm actually going to give you a link to my talk on the 19th of May 1536 so that you can find out more about Anne's final hours and her execution. But for today's talk, I'm going to stay in 1536, but I'm going to look at what Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, got up to on that day. Now, the Archbishop had been in what can only be described as an awful and unenviable position in May 1536. Queen Anne Boleyn had acted as his patron. He was a good friend of her family and of the Queen herself. And he was really shocked when he found out about her arrest. He'd been away from court at Knowle, his country residence. And he wrote to the king of his shock, saying he was clean amazed at what had happened. But there was absolutely nothing he could do to save her. Instead, he ended up having to visit her in her final days at the Tower of London to obtain her agreement to an annulment of her marriage to King Henry VIII, a marriage that he'd 3 years previously declared as good and valid. And he also had to hear the Queen's last confession. On the night of the 18th of May, in the early hours of the 19th of May, Cranmer obviously just couldn't sleep, for he was walking in his garden at the Archbishop's palace in Lambeth before the clock had even struck 4, when he received a visit from his good friend, Scottish theologian Alexander Elysius. Elysius was in quite a state, for he'd had a terrifying vision of Anne Boleyn's decapitated head. And immediately after he'd had this vision, he made his way to Lambeth to share it with the Archbishop, his very good friend. Elysius was unaware that Anne Boleyn was going to be executed that day. He'd stayed out of things, he just did not know. So Cranmer had to break the news of her scheduled execution. So Elysius told the Archbishop of this awful vision or nightmare he'd had, and then he recorded the Archbishop's reaction to his story of the vision. He continued in silent wonder for a while, and at length broke out into these words: "Do not you know what is to happen today?" And when I answered that I'd remained at home since the date of the Queen's imprisonment and knew nothing of what was going on, the Archbishop then raised his eyes to heaven and said, "She who has been the Queen of England upon earth will today become a queen in heaven." So great was his grief that he could say nothing more, and then he burst into tears. And to make matters worse, on that very same day, the day of Queen Anne Boleyn's execution, the Archbishop had to issue a dispensation for the king to marry again. Wife number 2 was being dispatched at the Tower of London. The Archbishop's friend was being killed, and the Archbishop was ordered to do this. It's just sickening, isn't it? But why did Henry and Jane Seymour, need a dispensation to get married? Well, they were related, they were fifth cousins, but the dispensation was not for that. It was for a marriage in the 3rd and 3rd degrees of affinity. Henry VIII's previous sexual relationships with Mary and Anne Boleyn put him within the prohibited degrees of affinity with Jane because the Boleyn girls were Jane's second cousins. Officially, they were second half cousins, sharing a great-grandmother, Elizabeth Cheney. Anne and Mary Boleyn's mother, Elizabeth Howard, was the daughter of Thomas Howard, who'd been Earl of Surrey when she was born, and Elizabeth Tilney, who was the daughter of Elizabeth Cheney and her first husband, Frederick Tilney. Jane Seymour's mother, Marjorie Wentworth, was the daughter of Sir Henry Wentworth and Anne Say. Anne Say was the daughter of Elizabeth Cheney and her second husband, Sir John Say. So Jane, Mary and Anne shared a maternal great-grandmother, but had different maternal great-grandfathers. This was enough to cause an impediment to Henry VIII's marriage to Jane, though. The church viewed such an affinity as incestuous unless it was dispensed by a church authority, in this case, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, I find this all rather perplexing when Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, was under the impression that the annulment of Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn had been granted on the grounds of an impediment of affinity on account of the king having had connection with her sister, Mary Boleyn. It all sounds rather hypocritical, don't you think? The following day, the 20th of May 1536, Henry VIII and Jane Seymour were officially betrothed. And then on the 30th of May 1536, just 11 days after the execution of wife number 2, Henry VIII married wife number 3. How quickly everything happened. Also on this day in Tudor history, the 19th of May 1554, in the reign of Queen Mary I, Anne Boleyn's daughter Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I, was released from the Tower of London after 2 months of imprisonment. Elizabeth wasn't free though, she was released into house arrest. Why? Why had she been imprisoned in the Tower and what happened next? Well, you can find out in last year's video, which I'll give you a link to. And I'll give you a link in the description to my video on Anne Boleyn's execution as well. You can subscribe to this channel by clicking that subscribe button there. You can give me a like and leave me a comment, and you can also hit the bell to be notified as these videos go live. I'll be back tomorrow. See you then. Bye.